Aloha and greetings to everyone. I'm Daniel Kaufman, and I'll be presenting today on behalf of my co-authors Victoria Chen and Braldey McDonnell on clitic positioning patterns in Western Austronesian languages. So Western Austronesian languages show an enormous range of typological variation in person marking. By person marking, we refer to cases of typical agreement, as well as pronominal clitics, as well as even free pronouns, the use of free pronouns. So we attempt here for the first time to map this variation, some of this variation, across the Austronesian languages of island Southeast Asia and Taiwan. We present prototypes for areas of relative homogeneity and show how much of this variation is surprisingly presaged by independent developments in Formosan languages. Finally, we conclude with speculations about directions of change and contact effects on clitic agreement patterns. A short caveat, so there's many subtle differences, as you can imagine, in the clitic and agreement systems throughout the Austronesian languages. So our presentation will necessarily gloss over many interesting differences in favor of presenting the big picture. For instance, Philippine languages show immense variation in the relative ordering of pronominal clitics and adverbial clitics within the clitic cluster, as well as other specific interactions between elements, but they overwhelmingly place pronominal clitics in second position. And that's the kind of thing we're focusing on today. Where in the clause are the clitics positioned? So there's a wide literature which tackles the development of agreement in Austronesian languages, and it was a topic of great interest to the Dutch linguists during the colonial period, as well as more recent linguists. But still, we believe this is really just the tip of the iceberg, considering the number of languages under consideration and the extreme complexity of the phenomena. It's quite a challenge to typify single language patterns in relation to pronoun or clitic positioning. So here we'll take a kind of geographical typological approach and speculate on the significance of certain recurring patterns. We don't have time, unfortunately, to engage with some of the proposals for how agreement develops, or whether it's incipient agreement, or whether it is the remnants of a more complex system. But hopefully our study can eventually say something to that. So some basic concepts about clitic position, case, and voice. So three most important positions that will be useful for this presentation is second position. So this refers to clitics that attach to the first phonological word in their syntactic domain. Second position clitics can attach to any type of word. Typically, they really don't care what their host is, so long as it's a phonological word. So they kind of avoid being first in their domain, and their domain is typically a clause, or at least for argument clitics. Then we have head adjacent clitics, and these attach either to the beginning or the end of a particular syntactic head, kind of more affix-like, but for certain reasons we might not want to call them affixes because of their looser attachment. And these head adjacent clitics typically do care about the syntactic category of their host. And then we have a rare pattern, which is the clause initial, clause final clitics. And these attach to the beginning or end of an entire clause, regardless of the category of the following or preceding word. With regard to argument type and case, we'll try to be as atheoretical or pre-theoretical as possible, although that's impossible, but there's many different language types and alignment types that we're trying to generalize over. So this system will serve us the best, we think. So we have the pivot, which is the obligatory and syntactically prominent argument of a typical or a conservative Austronesian clause. That's the thing that ergativists would call the absolutive argument, or non-ergativists might call the topic argument or the nominative argument, depending on their theory. And then we have the well-known system of dividing up the main participants of a transitive and intransitive clause. So the A is the kind of proto-agent, the most agent-like argument of a transitive clause. P is the most patient-like argument of a transitive clause. S is the sole argument of an intransitive predicate. And G for genitive is the case of possessors. And together with that, we also have voice or diathesis. So really the only thing that matters to us in that category is actor voice versus non-active voice. And not all languages maintain Austronesian voice, but for those that do, it will play an important role. So in the actor voice, it's the actor that is kind of promoted to the pivot relation, and in the non-actor voice, it's an undergoer, a patient, theme, or something else that's promoted to the pivot, while the actor is typically introduced either with genitive case or a special case or something else. And we have a mood distinction that plays a role in some languages, which is kind of a basic realis, irrealis, which is really a cover term, realis being anything that's factual, true, complete, or even perfective aspect, and irrealis being everything else. Just a short word about the sample, the data sample. So we have just under 100 languages covering Austronesian languages of Southeast Asia, and they were coded for clitic type, position, argument type, voice, mood, and several other properties, not in this presentation, based on descriptions and also some field notes. And we mapped this using the Ling typology package with coordinates from Glottolog. So here's a good map to start with. This tells us something fundamental about the position of pivot clitics. So the yellow dots represent languages where the pivot clitics, that is the kind of absolutive, nominative, whatever you want to call it, argument, shows up in second position when it's represented by a pronoun. So you see that the Philippines forms a pretty uniform block, and this is a recurring theme that with regard to most clitic positioning facts, the Philippines forms a kind of unified block here. And as soon as you go south, you get a much more diverse picture. So the languages in blue here don't have second position clitics, or they don't have clitics at all for the pivot. They have free pronouns. The purple languages use verbal enclitics or proclitics, and the languages here in cyan, is that cyan, use verbal enclitics, and the languages in black use verbal proclitics. So there's in a rather small area here, you have some extreme diversity of how the pivot, the most syntactically prominent argument, is expressed. What's maybe more surprising is that when we look at Taiwan, the Formosan languages, we also see there's quite a bit of diversity there. So here, although it's a bit occluded, you have three types at least: second position clitics for the pivot, free pronouns, and one language that attaches the clitics to the auxiliary, head adjacent clitics. And this also becomes a recurring theme, that Formosan languages show a surprising level of diversity for these types of patterns. So now that you've gotten the general idea, we can look a little bit more in more depth at the typological prototypes. So in the Philippine prototype, second position is king. Most Philippine languages have at least two sets of clitic pronouns. One that we'll call this G/A. It's a set of pronouns which is syncretic between the genitive and the agent of a non-actor voice predicate. So it serves to mark both, and this syncretism extends to full noun phrases as well. And it has the pivot series, right, as well as potentially other sets as well. Both of these types of clitics, these types of pronominal arguments, have to go in second position in the vast majority of Philippine languages, as you see here. Here are some 4 examples from Tagalog: binantayan mo sila, hindi mo sila binantayan, etc. And this simply shows that mo sila, the two pronominal arguments in the clause, have to follow the first word. They don't care exactly what category they're attaching to. They're attaching to what is essentially a phonological category, a prosodic word. Okay. And here, as we will show in the other examples, we give a kind of schematic summary of the structure. So this is the predicate, followed by the genitive agent clitic, followed by the pivot clitic. And in this prototype, the tense aspect mood categories really don't have any effect on clitic placement at all. And the lexical category of the predicate doesn't have an effect either. So you can see in this example, whether the predicate is verbal or more typically nominal, the clitics don't really care. So hindi ko siya nakita, I didn't see her, the clitics take the same position as they do in hindi ko siya kaibigan, he or she is not my friend. So where does this syncretism that I mentioned extend to? Well, we see that it's, again, the Philippines looks like a kind of solid typological block for this syncretism. And it extends into northern Borneo and northern Sulawesi. And then it's kind of, there's a smattering of this pattern in other areas in the Indo-Malaysian archipelago, but then in the Formosan languages, we also see a kind of mixed picture. So the Philippines, once again, looks like a kind of island of unity in diversity. If we look at the languages of Sulawesi in more depth, we see some kind of an interesting cline of how this Philippine pattern was lost. So in the north, you have what's essentially the Philippine type syncretism between the genitive and the agent clitics. And then moving southwards, well, you see languages that have lost it completely, but then you see these three orange languages, there's more of them in fact, which show syncretism, but only in the realis mode. So only in kind of perfective type contexts is there syncretism, and in the other context, you have the development of a new ergative type of clitic that I'll show in a minute. Here in Southeast Sulawesi, we see a syncretism, but only in relative clauses. So this is, and in the blue languages, as I said, the syncretism is totally lost. So in the Pomona Kaili prototype, which really contains several different cases, we can look at one version of it in Kulawi, where the syncretism breaks off in a kind of interesting way, but in a way that recurs throughout the languages of Indonesia. So in the left column, we see the syncretic clitic, which in green, right? Ihilukui, I saw him or her. And the ku there works for both genitive possessors as well as transitive agents. When it comes after the verb, it represents the agent, okay? And it sticks to the verb, as you see. So now we've diverged from the Philippine type pattern in that the agent clitic is now verb adjacent rather than second position. The pivot clitic, however, is still second position, as you see here, it attaches to negation. But in the irrealis clause, this is where the syncretism breaks down, and now we have a proclitic, which cannot be used for the genitive function. It can only be used for the agent function. So this is in the future, I will see him or her, and we get proclisis. And as you see here, the pivot is still second position like before. And when we find proclitics, almost always, or really always in the Indonesian languages we've observed, it's not proclisis to anything, it's proclisis to a verb, right? So you cannot get this agent proclisis of a noun, for instance, right? Of course, a noun shouldn't really have an agent, so that makes sense, but this underscores the fact that it really no longer has a genitive function. Okay. Moving further south, where we completely lose the syncretism, here we have all of the non-actor voice agents instantiated as verbal proclitics in blue, and the pivot still, like before, is second position. So that's the one thing that has stayed common from the Philippines to Central Sulawesi to South Sulawesi, is that we have more or less a line of second position pivot clitics. Meanwhile, the ergative genitive syncretism is completely lost here. As you see, the blue represents the agent, the transitive agent, and the green clitic here represents the possessor, which is still an N-clitic as it was in the what's probably the original Philippine pattern. So what happens with this the agent of the non-actor voice clause, or what the ergativists call the ergative argument? It turns out to also show some interesting variation. So again, the Philippines is a solid block. As we saw earlier, it's always in second position there. But we move to Sulawesi and we see many different possibilities here. In orange, there are verbal N-clitics. So they've gone from second position to becoming N-clitic. And in red, they alternate between enclitic and proclitic. In purple, they're strictly proclitic, and in black, there's no clitics at all. Again, we see the same kind of thing we saw earlier, which was diversity in Indonesian patterns and diversity in the Formosan languages as well. So you can see that there's enclitics, second position clitics, and verbal proclitics for this agent, this transitive agent function. How does this happen? How do they become proclitics? That's another interesting thing which has been noted for the languages of Sulawesi and Sumatra. It seems to follow a person hierarchy. So the first person becomes proclitic to the verb. In some languages, only the first person. In other languages, the first person and the second person. And in other languages, all persons. And it seems to strictly follow the person hierarchy with just very few exceptions. The second person doesn't become a verbal proclitic unless the first person has, and the third person doesn't become a proclitic unless the second and first person has. So this shows you in a bit more fine-grained detail the differences in which arguments, which persons and numbers procliticize. This is surprisingly true, this person creep or person hierarchy creep for the development of proclisis holds true not only in Sulawesi and Sumatra, but also across Rukai dialects, which is particularly interesting. So again, we see that Rukai, a Formosan language, seems to kind of presage certain developments further south, where certain Rukai dialects only procliticize the first person and others procliticize more of the pronominals. There's an outlier pattern, which I'll skip in the interest of time. So these are the clausal clitics in Manggarai and Tondano, extremely rare pattern where the clitic comes in the beginning and end, the end in Manggarai and the beginning of the clause in Tondano. And we find this really so far only in Manggarai, Tondano, and Iraya. So let's look at the Formosan languages in a little more detail. So we find that, as I said, that the Formosan languages seem to typify some of these prototypes, and in a way it appears as if the common proto-language had all of the ingredients for these developments to happen, and so they happened independently in different branches of Austronesian languages in Taiwan, as well as later in the Malayo-Polynesian languages. So in Sedik, you have what looks like very much a Philippine pattern. Second position clitics for both the genitive agents and agents, which are syncretic, and second position for pivots as well. In Puyuma, you have something that looks very much like a South Sulawesi prototype, which we saw earlier, where the genitive agent set becomes proclitic on the verb, although it can also occasionally appear on kind of these verbal type adverbs. And the pivot is a second position clitic. So you see when the verb or the adverb is first, it attaches to that, but if negation precedes it, it attaches to negation. There are a couple of caveats though. So in Puyuma, it seems that the pivot clitic in the last example cannot cross over the agent proclitic, which is totally possible and which is required actually in most Sulawesi languages that show this pattern, but this apparently is impossible in Puyuma. Also notice that the proclitic on the verb is still GA. That is, it's not a dedicated set marking agents. It also is still syncretic with the possessors. And that's true, as far as we can tell, for all of the proclitics in Formosan languages. When we find proclitics, they're actually not becoming strictly ergative or transitive agent clitics. They're actually attaching both to nouns as possessors and verbs as agents. So this is a really interesting difference from Formosan proclisis and Indonesian proclisis. We also have cases like Saisiat. I'll skip over this also in the interest of time. This is basically just a kind of simplification, it seems, a loss or absence of bound pronominal clitics altogether, although there's a case distinction. And Saisiat kind of looks like, well, many languages in Indonesia, that seem to have simplified this system and only use free pronouns. So colloquial Jakarta Malay does this as well. Dia mukul kita or kita dipukul sama dia, and both pronominal arguments, the preferred way of expressing them is as free pronouns. So shows a very unique development in which you have a syncretism between transitive agents and intransitive subjects. In other words, what looks like a real nominative type alignment for the clitics, and they have to attach to an auxiliary, right? One of the very few languages that really requires an inflected auxiliary almost in the beginning of the clause. And these are not syncretic with possessors, as you see on the right here. Different forms attached to the end of the noun phrase to mark a possessor. This is reflected to some degree, although somewhat abstractly, in Sasak, or at least some varieties of Sasak, where you seem to still have a diathesis between actor voice and non-actor voice, just like in So, but the clitics seem to really be marking a transitive agent or subject, as you see here. Ne, in all these cases, is the transitive agent or the subject. So it's really taking on a kind of nominative accusative type of alignment system in the agreement, while the full noun phrases seem to follow a more conservative pattern. I'll skip this in the interest of time as well. I want to just go straight to the chase, cut straight to the chase, as it were, and talk about the stability of these clitic patterns. So as we saw, at least with the Philippines and certain areas in Sulawesi, there appears to be some degree of homogeneity within the subgroups. So could clitic positioning then be used to assess subgroup membership, or is it too vulnerable to contact-driven change? There actually exists two good test cases to answer this question, which are like the inverse of each other. So the Sama Bajau languages of the Philippines emerged from Borneo within the last 1,000 or so years, perhaps more, but they've had heavy contact with Central Philippine languages over the last several centuries. On the other side, there's the greater Central Philippine languages that have expanded to North Sulawesi, maybe in around the same time period, or further back, and they have also had very intensive contact with neighboring non-Philippine languages and Malay. So remember that Philippine languages are overwhelmingly uniform in employing second position clitics for both the genitive agent argument and the pivot argument. And the most common pattern for the genitive agent argument in North Sulawesi and Borneo is verbal enclitic, so attaching directly to the end of the verb. So this is the map that we saw a little earlier about showing the non-actor voice agent position. So we see that there are, again, second position clitics in the Philippines. And then we see this borderland here between the Philippines and Indonesia, where you have verbal enclitics. Okay, so verbal enclitics in northern Sulawesi and some verbal enclitics in northern Borneo as well. So we can call this the second position zone. We can call this the verbal enclitic zone. And our question is to test how liable these are to contact-driven change. What happens when a language goes from one zone to the other? So the Sama Bajau languages, which went from the verb enclitic zone to the second position zone, show these facts. So this is from Bangingi in Sulu in the southern Philippines. Bangaku ingai pabilino. So this is if you won't sell to me, and you see the pivot is still second position, but the transitive agent is a verbal enclitic. It does not become a second position clitic under the influence of other Philippine languages. Abaknon, which is really far removed from the other Sama Bajau languages, it's really in the central Visayas region, and has really more intensive contact with Visayan languages, still shows the same pattern. So exactly like Bangingi and others Bajau languages. So kita here, the pivot clitic is second position, and ta, the transitive agent, is a verbal enclitic. Okay. Now, if we go to the other side of the story, these are now the Philippine languages from the second position zone moving into the verbal enclitic zone, Gorontalo, we see that the genitive agent clitics have also become verbal enclitics here, right? And this is presumably, Gorontalo had a system similar to other Philippine languages before it entered this zone, but now the genitive agent clitic has become a head adjacent enclitic that seeks out a verbal category. We could just see this, the pivot clitics are free pronouns. And in this last example, it shows that the genitive agent clitic cannot move to negation, apparently. It is stuck on the verb. So this suggests that when it comes to clitic position, language contact may hasten the journey of grammaticalization, but it does not reverse it. So if we think of this as a cline from free pronoun to second position clitic to verb adjacent clitic to verbal affix, it can go, contact can hasten the journey from second position clitic to verb adjacent clitic, but it can't go in the other direction. We also see in other areas how language contact has taken formerly free pronouns and turned them into second position clitics. So we see this in Brunei Malay, where Malay, which originally we know from written attestations, had free pronouns as pivot, pivot pronouns were free pronouns, and the transitive agents were enclitic in Old Malay and proclitic in Classical Malay. So what we see in the first example is probably the inherited pattern, but what's interesting is that the pivots become second position clitics due to the language shift from indigenous languages of Brunei to Malay. And same thing we even see in Ternate Chabacano, which is a Spanish-based Creole of the Philippines. Here, almost all of the lexical items in these examples comes from Spanish, but the free pronouns of Spanish have become second position clitics in Chabacano. Right? And this is true for all Chabacano varieties in the Philippines, all Spanish Creoles. So this shows that you can take a free pronoun, this used to be vos, yo, right, free pronouns, and turn them into second position clitics through contact. You can take second position clitics and turn them into verb adjacent clitics, but we don't find any convincing examples of degrammaticalization in the other direction. So to conclude, the mapping of person marking, although still in its early stages, already yields some interesting generalizations. We find that the relatively intense typological diversity in person marking patterns in Formosan languages mirrors their deep phylogenetic diversity, and we also see strong areal patterns, but closer investigation of the border areas suggests a limit on contact-induced changes. Okay, thank you very much, and apologies for going a little over time.